This is Trump on Earth. I'm Reed Frazier.
Good morning. It's great to be back in Pittsburgh.
EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler came to Pittsburgh recently and announced his agency was rolling back yet another big Obama-era climate rule.
Here's what we understand and what folks like the Sierra Club don't.
This time, the target was a rule on oil and gas emissions of methane, the powerful greenhouse gas that is a main component of natural gas.
Methane is valuable. It is your main product, not a byproduct. Or perhaps the Sierra Club does understand that, and they're trying to do to you what they did to the coal industry.
The Obama administration created the rule in 2016, and some big oil companies actually wanted the administration to keep it. But the Trump administration did away with it anyway. Why? Our next guest says there is a legal strategy at play aimed at future climate regulations. And he is Tim Puko. He covers energy policy at the Wall Street Journal. Tim, welcome.
It's great to be here.
Okay, so let's just get right to it. What did the initial rule say, and why did the Obama administration create it?
Yeah, let's start from the beginning. This came about in 2016 during President Obama's second term. There was a major push for new climate initiatives during that time. And methane was one of the top concerns. The administration had already done rules for emissions from power plants and greenhouse gas emissions from cars and trucks, the two biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions for the United States. But there was also major concern about methane. And the methane specifically coming from the oil and gas industry. Methane is an incredibly potent greenhouse gas. It accounts for about 10% of all emissions, or the equivalent of 10% of all emissions, and the oil and gas industry had long been its largest source. Drilling, of course, has been on the rise because of fracking, and the Obama administration targeted the oil and gas industry to try to stop those methane emissions. So they passed this series of standards in 2016. The core of it is a bunch of requirements that oil and gas companies check for leaks, specifically targeting methane periodically, and repair those leaks to make sure those emissions are not seeping into the atmosphere. So all that happened in 2016. And then when Trump won the election and became president, his administration started trying to get rid of it right away. They have a negative view of pretty much all climate policy, and specifically felt this one unfairly hurt the oil and gas industry. The president has been adamant about boosting output of oil and gas, and was concerned that the expense of these rules, especially for smaller and mid-sized companies, would reduce the amount that those companies are drilling all across the country. They made it a priority to roll these back. And it took them a while, but that is eventually what they did. This was a culmination. The third of the big Obama-era climate policies was wiped away. The essence of it was wiped away with this move.
But I understand that some big oil companies didn't want the administration to do away with it. Can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, climate is central to all this. One of the reasons that the U.S. and many other places around the world have switched to using so much natural gas is that its emissions are lower than the fuel that it replaced, coal. But there is a concern the benefits of making that switch from coal to gas are dramatically reduced, if not wiped out totally, if there are really severe methane emissions from the oil and gas industry, from production itself, from all these pipelines all across the country. At the end, it becomes a bottom line concern. The major companies have invested billions of dollars, not just in producing gas, but also in export terminals and import terminals around the world. They want to take this gas and be able to ship it to whatever market is going to pay the highest price. Europe is one logical destination, but Europe has been pushing I hesitate to use this term at the Wall Street Journal. We often don't like to, but effectively it's a crackdown. The European Union is much more concerned about climate change than the current U.S. administration is, and has been pushing to limit Europe's consumption of fuel that is heavy on greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a concern that other countries around the world will take a similar stance as climate concerns grow. So for BP and Shell, which are based out of Europe, and even Exxon, which is based in the U.S., there's a concern that their export business, shipping U.S. gas abroad, is going to be really hurt if the consumers elsewhere in the world don't think that the U.S. is doing a good enough job at regulating those emissions, stopping them, at ensuring that natural gas is really a much more climate-friendly alternative.
So, it does beg the question, if these oil companies like the rule, and a lot of people want the government to act on climate change, a majority of Americans want some type of climate policy, why take it away?
One of the major driving forces of this administration is that it wants to help mid-sized companies and smaller companies. This is a nuance that I try to remind people of all the time. It is not necessarily a business-friendly administration. It is an administration friendly to a certain type of business. And you've seen this play out in all types of policies. And Wheeler, the EPA administrator, Andrew Wheeler, when he was speaking in Pittsburgh, you must have sounded this, he was very blunt about the fact that they see these smaller companies as core to the U.S. economy.
We are launching a draft online compliance assistance center geared towards small and medium-sized operators and their contractors, those who don't have the resources to hire in-house environmental experts. Our goal is to free you to do what you do best, which is to innovate, create, and produce.
To some degree, they have a really legitimate point. A lot of these large companies like regulation, and they like complex regulation because they're the ones with the capital, they're the ones with the balance sheets that are big enough to pay for all this stuff. The smaller companies have less money to do that. The Trump administration would also tell you that a lot of the innovation in improving U.S. business, fracking is probably the best example of this, comes from the smaller companies. And so if they can roll back regulations that actually in the end help smaller companies but might kind of hurt larger companies, that's even better for them. That's something that they want to do.
There's a reticence to do something that would help kind of a big European-based company that pumps oil and gas from the U.S., but some of these smaller companies that are run by sort of, a charismatic CEO. Is that sort of the difference that you're talking about?
Yeah, and let's not downplay that. Like a lot of the CEOs of the mid-sized and smaller companies have been incredibly reliable donors to the Trump administration too, and close advisors at times to the president. There's both like a natural inclination by President Trump to be like anti-international corporations and act much more favorably towards the independent companies that are in many cases based in the states that have supported him with the most passion.
So let's talk about the long-term ramifications of this rule. Is there a sort of longer legal argument that the administration is trying to put together with reference to climate change?
Yes. So we talked about methane and why that's important, but there is a bigger game here. And it ties back to other priorities that have been at the top of the administration's list. I mentioned his aversion to regulations that are based on climate change. His administration has been filled out with people who share that philosophy. A little bit of history to help understand how this plays out is that one of the pivotal court rulings in the history of environmental policy and climate change policy in particular is Massachusetts versus EPA in 2007, which said that greenhouse gas emissions are essentially air pollutants that EPA has to regulate under the Clean Air Act. The EPA followed that up in 2009 with what we know as the endangerment finding, ruling that, in fact, those greenhouse gases do create a danger to public welfare and public health. And that ruling and that policy combined have created the precedent that EPA should be regulating greenhouse gas emissions. So even if Trump doesn't want to do that or wants to get rid of those regulations, a huge challenge for him and for all the people who work in his administration is this legal precedent. It handcuffs them in a real way where they can't just get rid of these rules without addressing that. The best examples are those other two policies that I mentioned already, the climate rules on power plants and the climate rules on cars and trucks. The administration, as much as it wanted to just get rid of those rules, in the end, it did not. It decided that the most effective thing it could do to achieve its goals was to simply weaken those regulations, loosen the requirements to give them more flexibility, or just change the severity of the limits that they have to hit. That has been a major source of frustration for people up and down the administration, and in particular at EPA. There was even a thought at the beginning of the administration, a lot of people pushed them to do this, to challenge the endangerment finding itself, to try to get rid of that precedent. But it's a very difficult thing to do. A lot of businesses don't want it because it would potentially create even more uncertainty. The same friction between large companies and mid-sized and smaller companies still applies. So the administration has never gone after that finding, but they have been looking for ways to deal with it and still get what they want.
Yeah, so they clearly don't like climate regulation, on ideological grounds, but certainly also, just material grounds. It costs companies money to not pollute in that way.
And those are costs that get passed on to the consumer too. That's also part of the fear that more climate regulation makes all forms of energy, which are cheap now, more expensive for the average consumer.
Good point. Fair enough. So they're against these climate regulations, but the law says, you got to regulate this stuff because it's bad for public health. And that's what the EPA does. It regulates things that are bad for public health, like, soot or ozone.
Yes.
Carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are part of that mix of things you got to regulate. So how are they getting around that?
They are seizing on part of the Clean Air Act that requires EPA to regulate air pollutants from industrial sources, if I can remember the exact words, that either cause or contribute significantly to a danger to public health and public welfare. It's the word significant and what it means that they're sinking their teeth into. There's a thought that maybe a lot of these greenhouse gas emissions that have been on the block for regulations aren't that significant. If climate change is a global problem. Emissions come from everywhere. It doesn't hurt DC or California or Texas worse than it hurts India or China or Europe, not in any real significant way. All the emissions go up into the atmosphere around the globe, and there are a lot of emissions. Let's take the methane emissions. I mentioned that methane emissions on the whole are equivalent to 10% of U.S. emissions. But that's not only oil and gas. Depending on how you define the oil and gas sector, maybe half of those emissions or less are actually from oil and gas. The oil and gas sector would claim that you should really just think about their wells. That EPA policy in the past has only thought of the oil and gas sector as oil and gas production. And so they'd say that, well, in the end, oil and gas production itself purely only accounts for 1.2% of those emissions. And if the U.S., I think it makes up about 15% of emissions worldwide. So if you're talking about emissions that are only 1% of 15% of the world's emissions, you can start shrinking the appearance of that number very quickly. If this all sounds tough to digest, there is a lot of legal maneuvering going on here. But what they're saying is that the more that you try to regulate greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S., you're zooming in onto contributors of those emissions that look smaller and smaller in the world stage. And that getting rid of any of them does not show a significant improvement in a global issue. And so, again, it depends on how you define the word significant. And what they're doing is trying to create a test for that. And if your test goes through the logic, if your test applies the logic that I just laid out for you, then you might get to a world where almost none of these emissions are significant. And therefore, there's no legal grounds for applying emissions regulations, emissions limits on any of them. That is the thought that they're following here.
Yeah, it's almost like a legal argument based on the basic argument that, well, why should we limit our emissions if China isn't going to? That's something that you hear a lot in
Yes.
sort of the oil and gas industry, the coal industry, a lot of fossil fuels. That's one of the reasons they're against this type of regulation because, let's say you just get rid of all oil and gas and coal in America, we're still going to have climate change unless other countries comply. I mean, of course, there is the whole issue of international diplomacy, and if the U.S. wants to try to enforce something like the Paris Agreement, it also has to do stuff to lower its emissions. So I guess that's sort of like the legal argument that they're making.
I would say that is one of the major lines of thinking that underpins their philosophy. Certainly for the president, that's important. I think that he's made it clear that he's always viewed international relations as a zero-sum game. He's not really a subscriber to the idea that a rising tide floats all boats. He's very much pursued a philosophy, America first. That's what they say that all the time, America first. And the idea that in his mind, and a lot of the people who fill out the ranks of the administration, international deals, the Paris Climate Accord among them, have not been good for the U.S. They place a disproportionate burden on the U.S. relative to the rest of the world. And they're just not interested in deals like that. You make the argument that climate change is a global problem, and the U.S. historically has been, the world's leader in emissions dating back more than 100 years, and that doesn't float with them. They're not interested. It's all about what's happening today, and America sacrificing to be a part of a global agreement to address a global problem does not appeal to them. And so, doing these climate regulations at home to try to help the U.S. contribute to solving a global problem, if they don't really believe that other countries are doing the same thing, they don't see that other countries have made the same emissions reductions in recent years that we have, and the historical reasons behind those trends don't matter to them. They just want a better deal for U.S. companies and U.S. consumers. And so the long-term threats of climate does not dictate what they want to be a part of. In fact, I shouldn't say that because it does dictate it, but it's the opposite. They're not interested in being part of global solutions or having the U.S. sacrifice on solutions. They want the U.S. to find ways where its businesses are benefiting. I don't know if I explained that last part very well, but I just bring this back to America first. That is the philosophy that guides them on this.
Let's talk about some hypotheticals since we're a few months away from election.
Sure.
If this turns out to be only a one-term Trump presidency, would this be relatively easy to unravel if Biden in fact wins?
What would make this really easy to unravel is not just Biden winning, but Democrats taking control of the Senate too. If you had Congress entirely controlled by Democrats with a simple majority, they could work under the CRA, the Congressional Review Act, and get rid of any recently adopted regulations under the Trump administration. How that law works is a little bit complicated, but for most everyone I've talked to, the timeline that it creates means that anything approved now is almost certainly within that window under which Congress has that power. And so you saw this happen to several things that the Obama administration did were wiped out pretty quickly in the first days of a new Republican Congress. A new Democratic Congress in 2021 could do the same thing. If they don't have control of the Senate and there's status quo in Congress, but Biden is in charge, then it becomes trickier and possibly a lengthier process. Maybe the quickest way in that scenario is if some of these lawsuits gain traction, they get favorable rulings. The Biden administration could withdraw their legal support. Maybe it goes through the courts quickly, and these rules are are just nixed by court decision. Otherwise, if that doesn't happen, then the Biden administration has to work on rollbacks, on regulatory changes in the same way that the Trump administration has done. And like I said, this methane set of standards was something that they wanted to get rid of from the earliest days, and it took them almost 4 years to do it. So there's, again, a lot of variables in play here. It could happen quickly, but there's a world in which it takes the Biden administration years to undo this.
Yeah, and let's talk about some of the other hurdles that the Trump administration might have in, getting this rule to see the light of day. What about legal challenges? Are there grounds to sort of vacate this rule because it, basically doesn't follow the endangerment finding and all the other precedents?
I certainly think that that's going to be the angle that environmental groups take in these lawsuits. All of these rollbacks get sued. And the administration, even while they're there to defend it, hasn't had a lot of success. Some of that was because they did novel things and lost a lot of court cases early on. But one case that I bring up in this context is about a parallel policy at the Department of Interior. The Bureau of Land Management had a similar set of rules that it applied to oil and gas drillers that were working on federal property. So in that case, the federal government's the leaseholder, and it has more leeway to require certain things from oil and gas companies. And the Trump administration, the Interior Department, basically just ripped up that rule to roll it back. And they lost a court decision on that recently, where the judge was pretty strong in her rhetoric and saying the administration had done a really poor job, most of all, in just explaining the rationale for their policy. It's not so much the endangerment finding that comes into play. In this particular case, it's something called the Administrative Procedures Act. And so what it requires is, and one of the reasons that these rollbacks take so long, is that anytime you do one, you have to have a really good rationale and very thoroughly explain why you're changing what had been done before. So the more dramatic departure you're making from what a prior administration did, especially like a really full reversal of policy, you've got to give a really solid rationale, both legally, but also based on whatever science is relevant, based on the process that you went through. You have to prove that it wasn't arbitrary. And they have already lost a few cases where even going up to the Supreme Court in the case over immigration, where judges have said, you have not done a thorough job, a legal job of following the Administrative Procedures Act. And if I remember correctly, in the Interior methane case, that was the primary grounds that judge ruled against them. So yeah, there are a lot of legal angles. And I promise you, the environmental groups and the states that are led by Democrats that challenge the administration a lot, they're going to pursue all of them.
All right. Well, I'm sure, Tim, you will break all the stories about those legal challenges just the way you've broken a lot of news on this rule. Tim Puko of the Wall Street Journal, thanks so much for joining us.
Reed, I appreciate your confidence, but from my years as a market reporter, I am obliged to tell you that past performance is not indicative of future returns. So thank you very much for having me here, and I'll do my best.
All right. Thanks, Tim. Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. If you like our show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. You can find us online at TrumpOnEarth.org, or you know where? Anywhere you get your podcasts. Write us a review and tell your friends. This podcast is supported by the Robert F. Schuman Foundation. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Kathy Nauer is the executive producer. I am Reed Frazier. I hope you stay safe. We'll see you next time.